I remember some time ago, a few years ago, I was in New York. I'd just come back from overseas. I think it was somewhere in Asia. And it was a long 13 or 14-hour haul, and you get off, whether you're in the body or out of the body, you cannot tell. You just show up. And I was looking at the marquee at the gate that I was to leave from, but it didn't say Atlanta, it said another city. So I saw a lady sitting at the corner there. I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, is this flight going to Atlanta?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "I'm sorry, because it said another city." "That's fine." So I walked over to get myself a cup of coffee or something, and I heard the patter of feet behind me. And she stopped, tapped me on the shoulder. She said, "Excuse me, are you Ravi Zacharias?" I said, "I'm afraid so." And answered her question. She said, "What a relief, because I didn't know you had questions also." Now, I kid you not, I'm not making up this story. I couldn't think up a story such as that. I didn't think you had questions also. All because I wanted to know whether the flight out of that jetway was heading to Atlanta. That's a simple question. We have more difficult ones. Do you hear of the two guys who are sitting across the table, and one fellow proposed to the other, and he said, "I'm thirsty. I can't quite afford a Coca-Cola, but let's have a bet. I'll ask myself a question, and if I can answer it, you buy me a Coke." Guy says, "That doesn't make sense." He said, No. Then you ask yourself a question, and if you answer it, I'll buy you a Coke. We'll keep going this way till one of us asks ourselves a question which we cannot answer. He said, "That is strange." He said, "You ask yourself a question, if you answer it, I'll buy you a Coke. I ask myself a question, if I answer it, you buy me a Coke, and we keep going till one of us asks ourselves a question we can't answer." He said, "Yeah." He said, "It works. Believe me, it works." So he said, "All right, since you proposed it, go first." He said, "My question to me is this: how can a rabbit dig a hole deep into the ground without throwing mud onto the outside?" And he said, "My answer to my question is it should start digging from the inside." The other guy looked at him and said, "How can I do that?" He said, "I don't know, that's your question." Sooner or later, we run into tripping ourselves up even when we know what the stakes are. I'll never forget when I was doing my postgraduate studies in Chicago, preparing for my doctoral examination, and you study all of the fine points of historical theology and all that kind of stuff, and your doctrinal distinctives for the denomination. All of this was in my head. And then I sat down at the desk, and you're not allowed to use any book except the Bible in answering this, a 6 or 7 page thing, and it said, "Keep your answers brief." And the first question was, "God is perfect, explain." God is perfect, explain. And I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult question I could think of is if it said, "Define God and give 2 examples." God is perfect, explain, and keep your answers brief. So I just put one line: He is the only entity in existence, the reason for whose existence is in Himself. Wow. All other entities have the reason for their existence outside of themselves. We are finite, dependent, caused. God is infinite, not contingent. He's a necessary being. It is impossible for God, by definition, therefore, not to be. He is non-dependent. His very existence is perfect. But that then spawns a myriad questions. One of them being something like this: if He is uncaused, infinite, non-dependent, necessary, why does He use language like this when He says, "You and I can cause Him grief"? Follow what I'm saying? How does a finite being wield such power and authority to cause an infinite being grief? And yet, God speaks in such analogical terms, doesn't He? You see, when we use language, Thomas Aquinas reminds us we use it in 3 different ways. We use it univocally, we use it equivocally, and we use it analogically. What did he mean by that? When you're using language univocally, what he means is if you use the same word in two different sentences, you are assuming, and the listener's assuming, that you're not equivocating on the terms. The words mean the same thing. If, for example, I say to you, God loves you, and you start pondering that thought, and after that the next statement is, and I want you to know I love you too. You don't start messing with the word love at this point. You're just taking it for granted that I'm using the word in a univocal sense. I'm not suddenly playing word games with you. But then all of a sudden you have to equivocate on words. They may be the same word, but it is not meaning in the same way because the context has changed. For example, if you were to be on a plane somewhere and you're not quite familiar with the person sitting next to you, although you think you've seen him somewhere, but prior to your boarding the plane, you talk to me and you say, Ravi, what do you love to do for fun? And I say, well, I love to play tennis. And you say, are you a good tennis player? And I say, well, yeah, okay, I do all right. I do all right with tennis. I would say, yeah, I'm a good tennis player. I used to be before I broke my back. And then you're sitting next to a plane, and you're in a plane, and you look to the guy next to you, and you say, nice to meet you, happy to meet you. Your name is? He says, I'm Roger Federer. And you say, what do you do for a living, Mr. Federer? And he says, I'm a tennis player. And you say, are you a good tennis player? And he said, yeah, I suppose I'd say to you, I'm a good tennis player. You'd make the biggest blunder if you say to him, you know, I know a fellow called Ravi Zacharias. He's a good tennis player. You're a good tennis player. You two boys need to get together and thrash the ball around a bit. When he says good for tennis and I say good for tennis, there's an interplanetary disjunction at that point. I could not even see the ball that's coming my way, leave alone ponder a return. The term is equivocated because of the context. Univocally, it means the same thing. Equivocally, the context changes. How do we use language with God? When God says, I love you, and I say, I love you, and we are not giving it a univocal meaning or an equivocal meaning, we are now borrowing from analogy. We are taking an analogical application for you to understand, and it is illustrated thus. When I say I love you and you refuse to love me, I hurt because I have lost something. When I say I love you and you refuse to love me, I hurt because I have lost something. When God says He loves you and you refuse to love God, God hurts too. Not because God has lost something, but you have lost something. That's the very perfection of His love. That's the very perfection of His love. C.S. Lewis talks about his own conversion to Christ. Remember those memorable words? You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of Him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet, that which I greatly feared, which at last had come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. But then listen to how he qualifies his description. I did not then see what is the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own 2 feet, but who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking and struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape? The words compelle intrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them. But properly understood, they plumb the depths of divine mercy, because the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and His compulsion is our liberation. Such a magnificent line there. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and His compulsion is our liberation. Remember the words of Francis Thompson, I fled Him down the nights and down the days, I fled Him down the arches of the years, I fled Him down the labyrinthine ways of my mind, and in the mist of tears I hid from Him. Up vistayed hopes I sped, and shot precipitated, adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears, from those strong feet that followed after. Listen to these words now. But with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and a voice beat more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee that dravest me. You drive love out of your life when you drive God out of your life. There is a beautiful book, probably the most compelling book in the Old Testament on the nature of God's love. And probably the finest slender book I have read on the subject is by the famed expositor G. Campbell Morgan in his book, The Heart and the Holiness of God. The Heart and the Holiness of God. It is on the book of Hosea. My message this morning is entitled, The Prophet Who Married a Prostitute. Let me read for you a few verses. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go take unto yourself an adulterous wife, and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, Call her Lo-Ruhamah. I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to the house of Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, nor by horses or horsemen, but by the Lord their God. After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, Call him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. 3 children. You've got Jezreel, Lo-Ami, and Lo-Ruhamah. Jezreel meaning judgment. Lo-Ruhamah, Ruhamah is the word for mercy, and Lo is the Hebrew negative, no more mercy. Ami is the word for people, Lo the Hebrew negative, Lo-Ami, you will not be my people. Judgment, no more mercy, not my people. Who would ever think of giving their children such names? Judgment, tidy up your room. No more mercy, come for dinner. Lot my people, are you ready for school? Every time they named their kids and called their name, it was a reminder of what God was about to do to the nation. And what I take you through is a whirlwind tour of this. The first thing you see so profoundly stated here is that God's love is always undeserved. You will never, ever merit that love. You do not earn that love. I recall Billy Graham being interviewed by the BBC many, many years ago. Graham is a very humble man. And I remember watching on television when a news reporter, not given to a lot of courtesy, looked at Billy Graham and he said, You know, Mr. Graham, I've heard many, many preachers better than you. Many more persuasive than you. Many more intellectual than you. Why is it that God has called you to be the evangelist to the world? Billy Graham, in his shy, retiring smile, said, You know, when I get to heaven, that is going to be my first question. Why me, Lord? Why did he call you? Why did he speak to you? Why did he draw you into the orb of his love so that you may understand how deeply he cares about you? Why is it the Apostle Paul refers to himself as the chief of all sinners, one abnormally born, dragged out of the womb, as it were, even from which Lewis gets his metaphor, dragged out of the king into the kingdom, kicking and screaming, the most reluctant convert in all of England. God's love is undeserved, always unmerited. How much this is the case is shown again and again as you trace the story of God's love in the Old Testament. You know, oftentimes you get a question from the floor, something like this: why is it that the God of the Old Testament seems so harsh and the God of the New Testament seems so loving and gentle and all? That is a total misunderstanding of the Old Testament corpus of material. You go and study these passages and what precedes them and what succeeds them. You see, Hosea is speaking to the northern kingdom of Israel in the late 700s before Christ. They are already a divided kingdom after Jeroboam's time. They did it for so-called religious reasons, because Jeroboam did not want to lose the north going to the south to worship. So he set up his own system in the north. And now we are looking at the late 700s before Christ, and Hosea is a prophet to the north. Only for a few fleeting moments does he pause in the middle of his message and looks to the south when he says to them, the north, Ephraim, has joined herself to idols. Leave her alone. In other words, don't be imitators of them. But his primary message is to the north. And he's talking to them about their imminent collapse, which would take place in about 722 before Christ. And he is describing what happens in this parsonage. A man by the name of Hosea, a holy man of God, joined to a woman called Gomer, who's a harlot, prostitute, paid by her lovers to lie with them. And as he sees these 3 children born and the home being shattered because of her prostitution, he wants to buy her back because he's commanded by God to love her. And you can imagine him standing outside the brothel in a lineup where other men are paying for her affection. She must have been an attractive kind of young woman to merit this kind of a profession. And he's standing in line, waiting to buy her back for half the price of a slave and a day's rations. You can imagine the conversations amongst the customers going on. But some rather saintly person comes to Hosea and says, you know what? I'm puzzled. You're a holy man of God. You're married to a prostitute like this. How do you justify this? Hosea probably said, you know, I'll be delighted to answer your question if you will first answer mine. How can a holy God like that be joined to an adulterous nation like ours? William T. Ears, the poet, said, how odd of God to choose the Jews. How odd of God to choose the Jews. Yet how odder still are those who reject whom God chose, is what he went on to say. How odd of God. Why didn't he choose Rome? Great imperial majesty. What a means to reveal his own majesty. Greece, great philosophers. The big 3, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, made life more confusing for millions after they're coming after them. Talking about shadows and reality and caves and metaphors and summum bonum and all this kind of stuff. If philosophy and theology asked the same questions, why didn't you choose Greece? Made it easier for the world to understand. Why didn't you choose Babylon? Think of the splendor of Babylon. No, it is not Rome. It is not Greece. It is not Babylon. He chose that tiny little nation that Rome enslaved, the Greeks mocked, and the Babylonians ultimately bullied. You are the apple of my eye, he said. You know, that's what it says in the English. There's no such phraseology in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it actually says, you're the little maiden of my eye. Do you know who the little maiden of your eye is, sir? That person whom you love so dearly that when she comes closer and closer and closer to you, if she looked into your eyeballs, she will see her own reflection. She is that little maiden of your eye. And God says to them, come close, come even closer. Look into my eyeballs. You are that little maiden in my eye. How odd of God to choose the Jews. How odder still are those who reject whom God chose. You today, if you know him, are loved by him, not because of any merit that you and I displayed. This truth of God's chesed, loving kindness, unmerited favor, divine mercy. I want you to hear me now. It is unique to the Judeo Christian faith. You will never find this in the pantheistic religions of the world. You will not find it in Islamic teaching. Why? In Islam, you earn. Your good deeds will have to outweigh your bad deeds. In the pantheistic religions, you pay. Every life is a rebirth. Every birth is a rebirth, where you pay the karmic consequence of your previous life. In other words, when you finally shake off karma, you have earned it. When you finally enter paradise in the Islamic world, you have earned it. Not so when the father runs out of the home and sees that little boy of his returning, all messed up and all ruined, and the older boy living in the household could not figure this out. Do you know what it means in Eastern narrative for a father who has been disrespected and abused by the son taking the right to his wealth even before the father had passed away? The son's request was tantamount to saying, I want you as if you were dead, give me my portion of the wealth. And the boy takes off. How many Eastern fathers do I know of, when that son returned, would leave the confines of their home and run to meet him? Not so. That son would have to come running into the household, fall flat at the feet of his father, clutch the ankles and feet and beg and beg and beg for mercy. This father runs out, wraps his arms around him and embraces him and finds him now to be alive, though he was once dead. That is chesed, divine, loving kindness and mercy, undeserved by that boy. That's the love of God. But secondly, it also shows that this love is one that grows and is sustained on relationship. Grows and sustains itself on a relationship. It doesn't build in a vacuum. You know, as I say, I don't look it, but I'm a grandfather. That was a nasty chuckle. You got the point. Yep, I am a grandfather. Had a nice little grandson last year. And Winston Churchill had a corporal once who came to him and said, Mr. Churchill, I've never spoken to you about my grandchildren, have I? Churchill said, no, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. So I won't extend that metaphor. I don't know what it is about grandkids. I heard stories about it, and now I find out it's real. And here's what my theory is. I like to make a theory on most things. You see, when you have your own kids, that available stock of emotion is so expended in worry and care and all that stuff that goes on around the house, you've got very little time to actually sit back and say, wow. And then when you're a grandkid, you've got all that available emotion, and let the second generation take care of all of the expenditure of energy, and you just sit back and say, wow. Joy. But the first time I became a father, never forget it. Never forget it. You know, when you marry, you're two adults saying, yes, I do, and you go and do. But with the little one, there's no such pledge from the other one coming into the world. I remember standing by the crib looking into that little one and saying, what on earth have I done? What have I done? This life is now going to be totally dependent on me. And my brother-in-law, who is a nuclear physicist by training, always had a way of asking questions wrongly phrased at the wrong time. So he said to me after I walked out of the delivery room and he and I were heading out for dinner that night, he said, what does it feel like to be a father? I said, why do you ask such questions? It's been a great day. Let's eat and let's enjoy it, you know. That night I went back to my room and our home, and I got a call about midnight from my wife saying, we've got a problem. Sarah has got a blood malady where she's allergic to her own blood, and her blood is actually being destroyed faster than it is giving her sustenance. All of a sudden, at the midnight hour, on the day one of our child, I knew what it felt like to be a father. You know, if you'd taken that child and put her amidst 100 others, I'd barely seen her for a few minutes. Chances are I would not have recognized her. It had taken me some time because of all the babies there. But if you'd asked me, are you sure you really love her? You yourself would have felt foolish asking that question. Love grows and sustains on the basis of an established relationship. There's not just a generality of love. There is a particularity of that person and the relationship that you enjoy. Once you learn to walk in the knowledge of God, you have that particularity of relationship with Him. He has that will and that purpose for you. You can grow and nurture it as only He promises. He wants you to experience it and understand it. May I say to you, this knowledge of a particular love in your life will rescue you from many a difficult philosophical question in your life. You know, I came to know Christ in the city of New Delhi, the land of my birth, India. I was born in Chennai in the south, raised in Delhi till I was 20, and my family moved to Canada. I came to know Christ when I was 17 years old on a bed of suicide. Life had fallen apart. Everything had fallen apart. Why? To a careless, indifferent, undisciplined youth, does God send a man with a little Bible in his hand to talk to me? When I never cracked open one on my own, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him and under running laughter, adown titanic gloom of chasmed fears, all this running away. When I saw him solidly built like a rock, we went out for lunch, and what he shared with me was the least of what I was expecting. He said, from the time I was 12, I was training for this event. I bought a camera, I filmed the world champion, cut every stride that he took, step by step by step. I used to put it up on my own little screen and watch and wondered where I was losing the time that I needed to gain. And finally, I came to a time where the Olympic selection committee selected me to represent the country. He said, I was still quite a bit off the world pace. He said, but I went with huge gusto. And I was there ready. I said, I remember that. He said, and all of a sudden I found myself in the finals and was about to pull off the biggest upset in my event. I'd gained nearly 6 or 7 seconds in that event, which was quite remarkable. He said, but you know, Ravi, my heart was breaking because from the time I was 12, my father kept calling me a loser. He said, you're never going to make it. You're never going to make it. He said, and he even refused to come to the Olympics. He said, you wasted all this money, all these years. You're going to come away empty-handed for what? Just to be able to say you've competed in the Olympics? He said, now I was awaiting the gunshot for the final, and I was being tipped to win the gold medal. He said, as I was getting ready, and the gunshot was about to sound, he said, from out of nowhere, the thought I least expected to come into my mind was the thought, is my daddy watching? He said, I lost a stride. But I breasted the tape, and I won a bronze. I said, that's not bad, is it? To be number 3 in the world? He said, no, I really am not talking about that. He said, I'd give up all the medals I've ever won to enjoy the love of my father. I didn't expect a whisper of that thought from a man so solidly built, now in his post-competitive years, wishing he had his dad's arms around him. What language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend? For this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. I don't have time to trace back to the book of Ezekiel, or trace forward, I should say, to the book of Ezekiel and on to Malachi. The book of Malachi begins with the verse, I have loved you. And you say, in what way? They didn't even understand what he meant. In Isaiah, he says, what more could I have done for you that I have not already done? Wherefore, when I'm looking for grapes, why are you bringing forth wild grapes? The idea of God's love punctuating through the Old Testament. I read Ezekiel 16, sometimes it's powerful in its analogy. So here it is, God's love, unmerited, grows on relationship, desperately needed. But then God comes up with a complaint, chapter 6 and verse 4. Your goodness is like the morning cloud and like the early dew, it goes away. What is he saying? He says, you know what? Just like Gomer, you come back home and apologize to your husband and to your children and say, I won't do it again. But a few days later, you're gone back into your prostitution. Like the dew is here for a moment and is gone. Like the cloud comes and it's gone. Your goodness is like the morning cloud. Like the early dew, it goes away. You know what God's biggest problem is with you and me? A fluctuating will. A fluctuating will. You can come forward, make a commitment, and then a month later you say, I don't feel the same anymore. What happened? See, the will is the greatest gift that God has given to you, but it's also the greatest vulnerability. What was the temptation of the garden? Very simple. Why don't you do this and you will be as God, knowing good and evil? What it really meant was, why don't you do this and you can define good and evil? You become the definer. You make your own absolutes. What greater privilege than that? You don't need God's absolutes. Make your own. And the day you defy this one law, you become the definer of all laws. The will. You know, my older brother in India was he was a computer systems engineer with IBM when we were living in Toronto, and he asked my father one day to arrange for him to find a bride in India. And I walked into his room, I said, let me get this straight. You're going to ask Dad to go and find a bride for you in India? You're all right? You're okay? Your every thinking is sane here? I said, you're not going to even go and check this out? He said, no, it's okay. It's okay. I said, Ajit, I don't believe this. And so every week we'd get an envelope full of pictures, photographs. What a lot of fun we had around the dinner table. That's a 7, that's an 8, this is a 6, this is a 5, you know, all of us pitching in, all on the basis of a photograph. That's it. You so much. And one day I sat him down before he was to go. He hadn't seen her. He was going to fly to Bombay, now called Mumbai. Politicians have nothing better to do than to change the names of cities. They flew to Mumbai. And he was going to arrive there on a Wednesday. He was going to be engaged on a Thursday, going to get married on a Saturday, turn around, come back on a Sunday. A 4-day deal. I said, now, what are you going to do when you arrive there and you look at her and say, good grief, what have I done? Or she looks at you and says, I hope it's his brother and not him that I'm looking at right now. What are you going to do? He said, let me tell you something, Rob. Let me tell you something. When you will to love somebody, you can. So, wow. Now, I don't want to take away from everything he said, but a lot of what he said is very true. Without the will, it's a drudgery. Without the emotions, it's a mockery. And you need both. You need that emotional stirring within you, but you need the will to honor and keep that commitment. Let your goodness not be like the morning cloud or like the dew. Next time you feel His presence, make that commitment, but nurture that commitment so His presence will ever be felt with you day after day after day. And that will is surrender. You see, God's love is unmerited. His heartache is our will. His response is, I will be to you as a moth, I will be to you as a lion, I will remove my presence and depart from you. What does a moth do? It weakens. What does a lion do? It tears apart. He said, I'll be to you as a moth, weakening your land. If you don't respond, I'll be to you as a lion, tearing up your nation. If you still don't respond, I will remove my presence and depart from you. May I dare suggest, living where I do in the United States, we are probably in that third stage right now. Ashley and I had a talk about this in Atlanta at one stage when he first came to talk to me about coming here. We lack wisdom. We lack wisdom. Do you know we talk so much about human rights? Ask the person who talks to you about human rights if they know that it also means to give a person the right to be human. What does it mean to be human? Talk to an average university student in North America, ask them to define life and purpose, ask them to define meaning, ask them to define absolutes, ask them to define love. All of these terms are with their feet firmly planted in midair. There's no solidity to it anymore. purely relativistic. I was at UCLA last week, California, liberal campus, and they asked me to speak on tolerance. Do you know how many showed up on that Wednesday night? Nearly 3,000 of them. They had to open up an extra room. Wow. When we did the same subject at Clemson in the South, 9,000. When John Lennox, Michael Ramsden, two of my colleagues, and I did an open forum on the defense of the Christian faith at the University of Arizona, which is one of the largest universities in the country. A few months before us, Richard Dawkins was there. They drew 3,000. When we did our open forum, they moved us to the basketball arena. Over 9,000 showed up for that. The hunger. They want answers to these questions. I give you this quote and move finally to my last thought. G.K. Chesterton, describing the world to which we were entering, said it in these powerful words. Please turn on the intensity of thinking here, because this is a mouthful of a quote. The new rebel who rebels against everything is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women, then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts, then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. It is Chesterton who went on to say, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a man ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. He may end up believing in anything. Wisdom. You know, our Richard Dawkins was recently interviewed, and he made an astounding comment. He said, just because you're hungry doesn't mean there is such a thing as food. He's countering Lewis's existential argument. But he was on a radio program on the BBC, you may have read it, it was absolutely fascinating. And he said to the former dean of St. Paul's, he looked at him, he himself is a bit of a liberal, but fascinating, he was taking on Dawkins. And he looked at the dean and he said to him, you know what, most Christians can't really name the four Gospels or even one Gospel. And the dean looked at him and he said, Richard, your favorite book is The Origin of Species? Yeah. Could you name the whole title? He said, yeah, I know the title. He said, go ahead. And I'm quoting you now, forgive me. He's on the air. He says, yeah, the title goes, The Origin of Species. Oh my God. Even an atheist had to call upon God to remind him of the book from which he stopped believing in him. By means of natural selection. He couldn't get those words out of his mouth. One president in Africa, after I finished speaking to the African presidents, took me by the arm. We were walking away, and he put his arm in mine, and he said, Mrs. Zacharias, our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. Where do you go for wisdom? Where do you go to face the tough questions of life? Corruption is here. It's inside. We really think in America we've got somebody who's going to solve all of our problems, materially, emotionally, this and that, and just by the stroke of a pen we're going to solve it. The country has never been more divided. The country has never been more of a monetary and fiscal mess than it is right now in its entire history. What's the biggest problem in India, the world's largest democracy? Corruption is systemic and endemic. And then we think we're going to solve it. No. God's response is pretty tough. And finally he says, you know what? If you'll turn to me, I'll heal your backsliding. I'll love you freely. Mine anger is turned away from you. The only recourse is to take that U-turn and come back to him. That's right. I don't know how far away from him you are today. Good. I really don't know. But take that U-turn. He's waiting for you. The great Canadian evangelist by the name of Chuck Templeton, who was a great preacher. I saw Billy Graham say to him, you'd have been the evangelist of the world, Chuck, if you'd stayed on path. But he walked away, took his postgraduate studies, lost his belief in God, and so on. Lee Strobel, who went to interview him afterwards, before he died. And a lot happened between that time too, and when he did die, by the way, in a conversation with Dr. Graham. But Lee looked at him and he said, Chuck, where's Jesus now in your life? He said, I want to say to you, I really miss him. I really miss him. You see, he puts life together for you. He's the skin that holds together the necessary components that you cannot keep together unless God puts it together for you. I'll close with this illustration, and they gave me plenty of time. It's just that I'm so disorganized, run out of it. So let me hurriedly give this to you. In the year 1971, when I was in my 20s, I was in Vietnam, preaching the length and breadth of the country, changed my whole life, brought revival in Vietnam. My interpreter, I've told the story in my book, I think, Walking from East to West. My interpreter was a 17-year-old guy by the name of Hien Pham. 17 years old. I was 25, 17, cumulative years, 42. And we're traveling around the country by motorbike and U.S. military choppers and C-130s, all this stuff. We're young. And when I bid him goodbye, I said, Hien, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. Thousands came to know Christ. I had my one sermon book, used to put it in my jacket pocket, preach from that the length of the country. I was still an undergrad student in theology. 17 years went by. 1988, I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, speaking. 11 o'clock at night, my phone rings. Brother Rafi. I said, Hien? He said, how did you know? I said, it's the way you always call me Brother Rafi. I said, you had that little musical note to your Brother Rafi? I said, where are you? He said, I'm in California. I said, what on earth are you doing here? He said, have you got some time? I said, yeah, tell me. He said, after Vietnam fell, the Viet Cong arrested me, put me in prison, because they said I was with the CIA. I said, I'm not with the CIA. I'm a teenager. They said, you interpreted. See, yeah, I interpreted for them. I was a translator. Had nothing to do with the American troops or anything other than being a translator in their commissaries and all this. They said, no, we are imprisoning you. And when they imprisoned him, they took away from him any English language books. They only gave him Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels, and Vietnamese and French. They tried to knock God out of me, he said. Finally, one day he said, I got so tired. I said, maybe God is not there. He said, my brother Rafi, I thought of you and your messages and all that we saw together. I kept thinking of you so much. But I was struggling. They were beating it out of me. And one night I said, tomorrow morning when I wake up, no God, no prayer. He said, in the morning they assigned me to clean the latrines. And when I walked into the latrine, I looked at the tin pot in there with all used toilet paper and human excrement. I had a mask over my head. He said, but I thought I saw something in English. I turned around, washed it, put it into my hip pocket. That night, late at night in bed, while everybody was asleep under my mosquito net in this room, I pulled out the piece of paper on the right-hand corner. It said Romans chapter 8. Started reading it, and all things work together for good. He said, I sobbed under my mosquito net. He said, who shall separate us from the love of God? He said, Jesus, you wouldn't leave me for even one day. He said, long story, I finally was released, and I started to build a boat to escape with 52 others. 4 days before I was to escape, Viet Cong come knocking on my door, armed to the teeth, and say, are you trying to escape? He said, no. He said, are you telling us the truth? He said, yes. After they left, I said, there I go, God, again, trying to do this my way. He said, I prayed a prayer I hoped would never be answered. Lord, if you want me to tell them the truth, let them come back. So the day before I was to leave, they come, grabbed me by the collar, rammed me against a wall. You're trying to escape, aren't you? He said, yes, with 52 others. Are you going to arrest me again? They said, no, we want to go with you. 4 of these guys got onto the boat with them, and he said, we were caught on the high seas and we were going to capsize, but these 4 guys were such good mariners, they got us to safety in Thailand. He said, and then I was given refugee status. I came to the United States. I'm doing my business degree at Berkeley now. And he said, I'm just calling to ask you if you'll come and officiate at my wedding. I met a beautiful young gal, a Vietnamese gal here that I want you to officiate. And this goes on and on. He came to visit me in Atlanta, and he sat down with my kids across the table. And they were so young then. And he said, you know what? You're always tempted to do it your way. He said, don't. Don't. He said, do it his way. He will honor and he will bless you. You know what? I don't know where you're at in your life, but if you're a typical audience, some of you are tempted to do it your way.
That's right.
God's love, God's heartache, God's response, and God's hope. I will heal your backsliding. I will love you freely, for mine anger is turned away from you. God invites you to come and celebrate that relationship. And I'm going to ask you to pray with me now at this time. Father, we need you.
Yes.
And only you are big enough to be able to heal us. Your love is so supreme and so superb. Our wills are so fragile. And yet as we look back upon life, we see how you're a grand weaver. You weave the design. Help us to do it your way. I pray for this audience. Many today probably in need of you. I'm going to ask you, if God has met you today where you are, in your seat, and you're dealing with him, will you do this right now? Don't look around. If you're saying in your heart, Ravi, please pray for me. I need to get right with him this day. Will you stand where you are? Just stand where you are. I'd like to say a word of prayer for you. Yes, God bless you. Just stand up. Don't wait for others. Do it as God is leading you. Yes, God bless you. You're standing. I'm going to wait a few moments more. Several of you upstairs. Yes, God bless you out there. Thank you. Father, for these that are on their feet especially, I pray it is an outstretched will that will not go just on feeling, but will go with a commitment to that will and make that life available to you in a fresh way. Pour out your benediction on the remainder of this conference. Make it a beautiful time of healing, restoration. I thank you especially for those who work so hard behind the scenes to make it possible. Bless them. Minister to the ones reaching out this morning. And Father, if there's somebody still struggling, like the hound of heaven, follow them to where they go from here, till they stop in their tracks and turn to you. May your benediction rest upon us. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. God bless you.